Mohon perhatian kepada Bapak dan Ibu, acara akan segera kami mulai. Selamat siang, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Terhormat Direktur Preservasi Arsip Nasional Republik Indonesia, Bapak Dr. Andes Agus Santoso M.Hum. Yang kami hormati para narasumber pada hari ini, Miss Femke Prinsen dan Miss Gabrielle Benches. Yang kami hormati pula Bapak dan Ibu peserta webinar yang berbahagia. Syukur kita panjatkan kehadirat Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, Tuhan yang Maha Esa, karena atas berkat dan rahmat-Nya kita semua diperkenankan untuk bergabung melalui aplikasi Zoom Cloud Meeting pada hari ini, Selasa tanggal 10 Mei tahun 2022, dalam acara Preservasi dengan tema Preservation of Archive in Tropical Climates. Bapak dan Ibu peserta webinar yang kami hormati, perlu kami informasikan bahwa webinar pada hari ini juga ditayangkan melalui channel YouTube Arsip Nasional Republik Indonesia. Selain itu, juga dalam webinar kali ini terdapat penerjemahan bahasa Indonesia ke dalam bahasa Inggris pada channel Inggris dan penerjemahan bahasa Inggris ke dalam bahasa Indonesia dalam channel Indonesia. Sehingga kami harap Bapak dan Ibu dapat menyesuaikan pengaturan webinar pada aplikasi Zoom Bapak dan Ibu masing-masing. Pada siang hari ini, marilah bersama-sama kita menyanyikan lagu kebangsaan Indonesia Raya, dilanjutkan dengan menyanyikan lagu Mars Kearsipan Indonesia. Bapak dan Ibu, kami perkenankan untuk dapat duduk dengan sikap sempurna.
Kejayaan membangun bidang kearsipan sebagai jati diri bangsa kita. Selalu responsif, antisipatif, bersikap profesional, sinergikan semangat perubahan, satukan langkah dalam menjaya. Kami menjamin tersedianya aksi sebagai bukti akuntabilitas kinerja, mampu menghadapi segala tantangan, bangga jadi bangsa Indonesia. Lembaga kearsipan Republik Indonesia, junjung tinggi identitas bangsa, jaga warisan nasional dan budaya demi kejayaan Indonesia. Kearsipan Republik Indonesia.
Berbahagia, tentunya kita berharap agar acara pada siang hari ini dapat berjalan dengan tertib dan lancar. Untuk itu, marilah kita tundukkan kepala kita sejenak untuk berdoa bersama yang akan dipandu oleh Bapak Muhammad Mujiamin. Kepada Bapak Mujiamin, kami persilakan.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bapak Ibu hadirin sekalian, izinkan saya memimpin doa dengan cara Islam. Bapak Ibu hadirin sekalian, mohon berkenan untuk menyesuaikan sesuai dengan keyakinannya masing-masing. A'udzubillahi minasyaitonirrajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. Hamdan yamahu wa yukafi mazidah. Ya Rabbana lakal hamdu wa lakal syukru kama yanbaghi li jalalika wajhikal karim wa azimi sultanik. Allahumma shalli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama shallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim wa barik ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim fil alamin innaka Hamidum Majid. Ya Allah, ya Tuhan kami, segala puji untukmu, pemelihara alam semesta. Segala puji atas karunia dan kenikmatan yang telah Engkau limpahkan kepada kami. Segala puji atas keagungan-Mu. Segala puji atas kemuliaan dan kekuasaan-Mu. Ya Malik, ya Kudus, kami agungkan nama-Mu karena hanya Engkau-lah Tuhan kami. Hanya kepadamu kami bersujud, hanya kepadamu kami bersyukur, dan hanya kepadamu kami memanjatkan doa. Ya Rahman, ya Rahim, hanya kepadamu kami menyembah, dan hanya kepadamu kami memohon pertolongan. Ya Rabbana, hari ini kami berkumpul di sini melalui media SoundCloud arsip daerah beriklim topis dalam rangka menambah wawasan dan pengetahuan kami mengenai kearsipan. Karenanya ya Allah, lancarkanlah acara kami, berkahilah dan penuhilah pertemuan ini dengan kebaikan dari awal hingga akhir nanti. Ya Allah yang maha mengetahui yang gaib, bimbinglah kami dengan hidayah-Mu, berkahilah kami selalu dengan takdir-Mu, dan jadikanlah hati kami selalu ridho dengan pemberian-Mu. Allahumma arinal haqqa haqqan warzuqna ittiba'ah wa arinal batila batilan warzuqna istinabah. Ya Allah, tunjukkanlah kepada kami bahwa yang benar adalah benar, dan berikan kepada kami kekuatan dan kemampuan untuk menjalankannya, serta tunjukkan bahwa yang salah adalah salah, dan berikan kepada kami kekuatan dan kemampuan untuk meninggalkannya. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanah wa fil akhirati hasanah wa qina adzabannar. Ya Allah, ya Tuhan kami, limpahkanlah kepada kami kebahagiaan di dunia dan kebahagiaan di akhirat, dan hindarkanlah kami dari azab api neraka-Mu. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun, wa salamun alal mursalin, walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bapak dan Ibu peserta webinar yang kami hormati, sebagai pembukaan acara pada siang hari ini, maka akan disampaikan sambutan oleh Direktur Preservasi Arsip Nasional
terhormat para pimpinan tinggi media dan Pratama Arsip Nasional Republik Indonesia, yang terhormat narasumber Femke Prinsen selaku Book and Paper Conservator dan Conversation, konsultan Conservation, konsultan di Arsip Nasional Belanda, narasumber Gabriel Benches selaku Conservation, konsultan di Arsip Nasional Belanda juga, para pejabat struktural dan fungsional di lingkungan ANRI, serta para peserta webinar konservasi arsip yang berbahagia. Pertama-tama, marilah kita panjatkan segala puji dan syukur kehadirat Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, Tuhan Yang Maha Esa, karena atas rahmat dan berkatnya kita dapat berkumpul pada siang hari ini secara daring melalui Zoom meeting dan kanal YouTube Arsip Nasional Republik Indonesia pada kegiatan webinar Preservasi Arsip seri kedua dengan tema Preservation on Archives in Tropical Climates dalam keadaan sehat. Para peserta webinar yang saya hormati, Indonesia merupakan negara tropis yang terletak di garis khatulistiwa. Letak geografis Indonesia yang berada di wilayah tropis menjadi tantangan tersendiri dalam mempreservasi arsip. Kondisi iklim tropis dapat memicu kerentanan kerusakan arsip, termasuk juga dengan terjadinya bencana alam di berbagai wilayah Indonesia. Proses kerusakan arsip di daerah tropis sangat kompleks. Indonesia sebagai negara tropis memiliki suhu yang hangat dan udara yang sangat lembab sepanjang tahun. Akibatnya, arsip akan cepat mengalami pelapukan dan rentan rusak jika tidak disimpan dalam suhu dan kelembapan yang sesuai. Dibutuhkan tindakan preservasi yang tepat, baik secara preventif maupun kuratif, untuk melakukan pelestarian arsip dalam jangka panjang. Aspek preservasi preventif lebih diutamakan yaitu depo penyimpanan, pengelolaan hama terpadu, reproduksi dan alih media, dan perencanaan menghadapi bencana. Dalam mengelola tempat penyimpanan arsip sebagai salah satu aspek yang penting, dibutuhkan pengaruh peralatan berupa sistem pendingin udara dan pengatur kelembapan dehumidifier menyangkut usia arsip. Sedangkan aspek preservasi kuratif adalah perawatan arsip, statis, reproduksi, dan alih media. Para peserta webinar yang saya hormati, terkait dengan tindakan preservasi arsip di wilayah tropis tersebut, Direktorat Preservasi Arsip ANRI akan melaksanakan webinar Preservasi Arsip seri kedua dengan tema Preservation of Archives in Tropical Climates. Dengan mengundang 2 narasumber dari Arsip Nasional Belanda yang sangat berpengalaman dalam bidang preservasi dan konservasi arsip seperti yang telah disampaikan pada awal pembicaraan. Kedua narasumber tersebut merupakan rekomendasi dari Mr. Rene Teigler. Beliau merupakan pengarang buku Preservation of Archives in Tropical Climates yang diterbitkan bersama oleh ICA, ANRI, dan NAN pada tahun 2001. Sebagai informasi, saat ini telah terdaftar sekian ratus orang jumlah peserta webinar, peserta arsip seri kedua. Melihat banyaknya jumlah peserta yang mengikuti webinar ini diharapkan menjadi bukti bahwa masyarakat Indonesia dengan kesadarannya yang tinggi turut berpartisipasi secara aktif untuk memajukan dan mengembangkan kearsipan di tanah air. Para peserta webinar yang kami hormati, dalam kesempatan kali ini perkenankan saya mengucapkan terima kasih kepada kedua narasumber serta panitia yang turut menyelesaikan acara webinar preservasi arsip ini sehingga dapat berjalan dengan lancar. Sebelum menutup sambutan ini, perkenankan saya membacakan sebuah pantun. Pergi ke pasar Klewer memberi batik. Batik dibawa ke kota Prapat. Mari kita ikuti webinar ini dengan baik. Semoga kita memperoleh pengetahuan yang bermanfaat. Demikian sambutan singkat yang dapat saya sampaikan dengan membaca Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Kegiatan webinar peserta arsip seri kedua dengan resmi saya buka. Selamat mengikuti. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Santi Santi Om Namo Buddhaya. Selamat siang.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang dan terima kasih kepada Bapak Agus Santoso atas sambutan yang telah Bapak sampaikan. Pada Bapak dan Ibu, kami mohon waktu sejenak untuk mempersiapkan acara selanjutnya. Baik, kami mohon maaf kepada Bapak dan Ibu hadirin peserta webinar. Terdapat kendala teknis dan banyak atas pengertian dari Bapak dan Ibu. Dengan demikian telah preservasi seri kedua dengan tema Preservation of Archive in Tropical Climates. Dan acara selanjutnya adalah pemaparan materi oleh para narasumber yang akan dipandu oleh moderator yaitu Bapak Anwar Asraf SHUM. Kepada Bapak Anwar Asraf kami persilakan. Selamat siang Bapak Anwar Asraf.
Selamat siang Ibu Beli. Terima kasih atas pembukaannya luar biasa Ibu.
Terima kasih Bapak.
Apa kabar Ibu?
Alhamdulillah baik Bapak. Apa kabar Bapak Anwar?
Baik sekali. Ibu Beli jika saya untuk mengambil alih acara webinarnya Ibu.
Baik Bapak Anwar Asraf, untuk webinar kami persilakan untuk diambil alih.
Terima kasih. Saya informasikan untuk seluruh peserta webinar bahwa webinar ini dilaksanakan dalam bahasa Inggris, tapi jangan khawatir Bapak Ibu karena kami menyediakan kanal interpreter. Jadi Bapak Ibu dapat mengganti bahasa dalam bahasa Indonesia agar Bapak Ibu dapat mengikuti webinar dengan baik. Not worry, we have our interpreter channel. So if you wish to change the language into Indonesian, you can do it right now so that you can catch up the webinar. First of all, I would like to greet all special invitees and our two speakers. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam damai sejahtera untuk kita semua. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam, salam kebajikan. Archives Conservation Deputy, the National Archives of the Republik Indonesia, Mr. Kandan. The Honorable Archives Preservation Director of the National Archives of the Republik Indonesia, Mr. Agus Santoso. The Honorable Archives Conservation Consultant of the National Archives of the Netherlands, Ms. Femke Prinsen. The Honorable Senior Conservation Consultant of the National Archives of the Netherlands, Ms. Gabriele Beentjes. And my name is Anwar Ashraf. I'm an archivist at National Archives of the Republik Indonesia. In this beautiful occasion, I will be a moderator who will guide the webinar and also the discussion session. I'd like to thank everyone for joining to this webinar. Good afternoon, everyone from all cities around Indonesia. How are you today? I hope that you are always healthy and happy so that you can do all of your activities today. And I would like to thank Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala for His mercy and blessing so that we can hold a webinar called Preservation of Archives in Tropical Climates. I would like to inform you that today we have our second webinar from our webinar series in 2022 that are held by Archive Preservation Department of the National Archives of the Republik Indonesia. This webinar is recorded and you can find the recorded video on our YouTube channel, Arsip Nasional LI. So please like the videos and subscribe our channel to know more about our future events. Now, I would like to read out the regulation of the webinar. The speakers have 60 minutes to give presentation to all participants. While the speakers are giving presentation, there must not be any interruptions. After the speakers have finished giving the presentation, there will be Q&A or discussion session. In that session, the questions from the participants will be read out and then answered by the speaker. All participants can ask questions regarding to the presentation. Our webinar committee will open the room chat after the presentation is finished, and we will choose the best question to get reward from us. So don't forget to say your name and your institution before you ask your question. So all participants, we have a webinar called Preservation of Archives in Tropical Climates. We are going to learn the challenges to save all archives in tropical climates which have hot temperature and high humidity that are not good for the archives we are having right now. It is also a common problem here in Indonesia that the archives are getting broken day by day, so that we have to ramp up our productivity in archives restoration, reproduction, and digitalization in order to save the physics of the archives as well as the information it contains. We are also going to the disaster and pest management. This morning, we have two main speakers from the National Archives of the Netherlands, Ms. Femke Prinsen and Ms. Gabriele Beentjes. They will give presentation about preservation of archives in tropical climates. Firstly, I would like to talk to both of our speakers. En mevrouw Gabriele en mevrouw Femke, how are you today? Who is that naturally?
Het is goed. I'm good.
Yeah,
I'm a bit sick, but I'm also good.
Yeah, so it is an honor to have you as our speakers today. Before you give your presentation, I would like to describe shortly about your CVs to all participants. So, okay, could you share the CV of Ms. Gabriele? Gabriele Beentjes is Senior Conservation Consultant at the National Archives of the Netherlands since 2008. She graduated a Master of Research at University College of London in 2014 with a thesis on effectivity of digital copies and archival materials. As a conservation consultant, Gabriele is concerned with issues related to preventive conservation like climatization and risk management. Since 2020, she combines her conservation activities with coordinating a team working at the extra archival storage facility in Emmen in the northeast of the Netherlands. And then now I would like to discuss shortly about a CV from Ms. Femke. So the committee, could you share the CV of Ms. Femke? Okay. Femke Prison is a book and paper conservator at Netherlands Institute for Cultural Heritage and historian at Universiteit van Groningen. In 2020, she exchanged her job as a book and paper conservator at the National Archives of the Netherlands for a job as a conservation consultant at the same place. Before working for the National Archives, she was a researcher at the Department of Medieval History in Groningen for 4 years. She worked as a book conservator on medieval manuscripts at the Herzog August Library in Wolfenbüttel for 3.5 years. And she was also a lecturer book conservation at the Conservation and Restoration of Cultural Heritage Program at the University of Amsterdam for 5 years. She has published on medieval book bindings, the use of waste material in books, decision-making processes, and digitalization of manuscripts. So that is a brief profile from Ms. Gabriele and Ms. Femke. So, Ms. Gabriele and Ms. Femke, without any further ado, the floor is yours. De tijd is van jullie. Gaan jullie gang.
Thank you very much. I leave the floor to Gabriele.
Yeah, that's okay.
Well, thank you for your kind introduction. And Femke and I would like to thank you for your kind invitation to give a presentation. And we are very happy to be here with you. In preparation of this presentation, we have asked Mr. Dani Sugiarto to collect some questions about topics that you are interested in. On receiving those, we have tried to group the questions in several themes, like ethics, conservation planning, environmental control, etc. These themes will be discussed during the presentation, and we hope they will provide answers to your questions. If not, after the presentation, there is time for discussions. Next slide, please. The first question is about that we still find archives that are in a poor condition, and we cannot do anything to save the archives nor the information they have. And what should we do with those? Well, archives are kept because of the information they contain. As long as the information is retrievable, one should keep the archival documents. However, in some cases, it may be better to copy the documents for use, either digitally or in any other way. We suppose it is all about considering and weighing the importance of the information and the importance of the physical carrier with that. Importance can include social value, historical value, symbolic value, religious value, etc. Based on this consideration, you can decide whether it's worth just restoring the documents, restoring and digitizing them, or just digitizing them, and whether or not the original document can be destroyed afterwards, because the copy is as informative and valuable as the original. Next slide, please. For example, these pictures are taken during a restoration and digitization project of civil state documents of the Caribs, As you can see, many of them were not much more than fragments. Nevertheless, because of the personal information and historic value of these documents, it is decided to restore as much as possible of them in order to keep these original documents for future generations, even though they have been digitized. The documents are still fragile, therefore only the digital copies are to be used. Those fragments that could not be found to fit somewhere are gathered in a box and stored as such. This is an example of documents that are deemed too valuable to discard, even though they are fragmented. In other words, I suppose there is no argument to throw away archives other than when the information they contain is not retrievable in any way. However, one should take in mind that archives that seem to be inaccessible at the moment might very well be accessible in the future. For example, because new methods for restoring are developed, or because new imaging techniques can be applied. Throwing away archives means no chance whatsoever to retrieve information, now nor in the future. Next slide, please. Another question was, in our archives restoration, we tend to fully restore the archives in one collection, although just some of them are broken. What do you think about this? Well, firstly, in conservation ethics, in general, one should never do more than strictly necessary to keep the document accessible. It is a good rule of thumb to base the decision to treat or not to treat on the risk of aggravation of the damage. We value the original state of the document most, that is, the document as it comes to us. Everything you do changes the document, and every restoration brings the implicit risk of unwanted side effects. This is why we restorers should consider the consequences and possible risks of every treatment, including not treating. Next question, please. Oh, next slide, yeah. These pictures, for example, show a book that looks severely damaged. The parchment cover is incomplete, the spine is uncovered, and we can see the binding structure. However, we don't really need this part of the cover for the book to function as a book. It can be read perfectly, perhaps even better than when the often rather rigid parchment back cover would still be there. Because the damage will not lead to further damage and the information is still fully accessible, there's no need to restore this kind of damage. Whether one should treat whole archives or rather just the damaged documents is, if you focus on damaged archives only, you can probably do more than if you aim to treat whole collections. On the other hand, it can be wise to consider if damage can be prevented by some kind of treatment. For example, by de-acidifying a collection that can be expected to decay due to acids in the paper, but of which the paper itself is not yet brittle. Next slide, please. Perhaps a bit of theory helps in these dilemmas. Conservation can be seen as a complex of measures and actions that have effect on a collection as a whole or a part of it. More official, conservation is about all actions aimed at sustaining cultural heritage and its significance in order to make it accessible for present and future generations. It includes preventive conservation, passive and active conservation, and restoration. Next slide, please. Starting on the outside of the shell, preventive conservation is about training and the development of consciousness about the value and vulnerability of the heritage collection. It is about indirect measures and actions that are aimed at avoiding and minimizing future deterioration, damage, and loss. Knowing that handling is the main cause of damage, a training in how to handle fragile documents, for example, how to hold and move them, is very useful to prevent mechanical damage. Next slide, please. Through passive conservation, care is taken of the whole collection by taking care of its surroundings. A clean environment, climate control, regular checking on mold and pests are all passive conservation actions that are mandatory when taking care of a collection. Restoring a single item is not very useful when the environment where it returns will again cause damage. Next slide, please. Active conservation is object-based, but does still not involve full restoration. Conservation is aimed to stabilize or recover the functionality of an object. It may be packing, but also cleaning the object. Mass conservation implies a uniform treatment applied to a large number of objects in similar condition, like deacidification and disinfection. Digitization can be seen as active conservation, especially if afterwards the digital copy is the user copy and the object itself is safely stored. Next slide, please. Restoration represents all actions taken to extend the life of the object in its observable appearance. It should be done in accordance with the rules of ethics and preserving historical integrity in mind. Next slide, please. With limited budget, it is always difficult to decide which measure has the most impact on the collection or the institution. Generally speaking, one might say that measures that affect the whole collection have the most impact, like climatization. On the other hand, restoration of a very important document and showing that to the public may convince people of the importance of the collection and the institution, resulting in a rise of funds. In other words, deciding which measure is most effective is not easy and dependent on several aspects. Next slide, please. That said, and keeping in mind that one can only choose to restore one object if one has a clear view of the situation and condition of the whole collection, a damage assessment or survey can be very helpful. Depending on what kind of information you need, this can be a random survey or an assessment of each individual object. Next slide, please. In order to perform a survey, a certain amount of boxes, books, or inventory numbers should be randomly chosen. The exact amount of objects is dependent on the volume of the collection studied. There are guidelines of how many objects have to be surveyed in order to obtain a representative impression of the whole collection. The assessment can be focused on one specific characteristic, like in this particular example. This survey is focused on pH, or acidity of the paper. We want to know whether this archive would profit from the acidification. We tested a representative amount of papers and can conclude that the average pH is about 4.5, which is, in combination with the general appearance of the documents and their information value, reason to indeed deacidify. The result of this kind of survey is that you obtain a general impression of the problems, damage or whatever, of a specific collection. Based on this, you can inform the management that you would like to start a project to, in this case, deacidify the studied collection. Next slide, please. Another option is an assessment where you note in more detail what kind of object you're looking at, whether there are specific characteristics that need attention, what kind of damage it has, and how much of it. For example, how many pages or centimeters should be repaired to be able to digitize the whole document. This kind of assessment serves as a planning tool, as the result tells you how much damage is to be expected in this collection, based on which it is possible to estimate how long it will take to, for example, prepare the collection for digitization. Next slide, please. Another question was about the causes of archival damage from the archive material itself, for example, and how to solve this. Next slide, please. When paper degrades because of the materials it consists of, like the kind of paper fiber, adhesives, and inks, it is called autonomous decay. These processes cause breakage of paper fibers and often causes the paper to yellow and become brittle. This kind of degradation can partly be slowed down by proper storage, as cool and dry as possible. If you want to treat the paper to prevent further damage, in some cases deacidification is an option. In this process, the acid in the paper is neutralized, the reaction stopped, and the lifetime of the paper prolonged. Next slide, please. Iron gall ink in humid conditions like in Indonesia will cause ink corrosion, a kind of reaction that, as it were, burns the paper where the ink is. This results in brown halos around the text, and finally the text will fall out of the paper. As you can see in the image, first some fluorescence takes place around the ink, extending through the paper to the verso of the paper, and after that the fluorescing changes color, from light brown to dark brown to almost even black. The discoloration comes with growing brittleness of the fibers, finally resulting in cracking and loss of material. Treatment with phytate might solve this problem. However, the treatment is rather time-consuming and only applicable on loose pages. Another problem of pages written with iron gall ink is that the process of ink corrosion is accelerated by water. This means that you cannot use any adhesive based on water to repair the damage. As with most deterioration mechanisms, cool, and in this case especially dry storage, slows down the reaction. We'll come back to storage climates later on in this presentation. Next slide, please. This question is about how to store other things than just paper documents and objects that are often found within the archives. Well, materials found in the archives, they may cause damage to other documents. This can be very acid paper, for example, newspapers that affect other papers, or other organic materials that are very acid. Or there are materials that due to their form or material may cause damage, like the bullets and badges mentioned in this question. In all of these cases, packing them separately is necessary to prevent damage on surrounding materials. Next slide, please. In the example on the pictures, objects are packed in mylar pocket sleeves with an acid-free paper as background where the name of the archive and the inventory number can be noted. The sleeve is closed with a piece of self-adhesive archival tape. When packing this type of object separately, next thing to decide is whether it is necessary to also store these objects apart from the rest of the archive. That is more of a practical decision. If you have the possibility of very adequate registration or administration, it is no problem to collect all of this kind of uncommon materials in one place in your depot, separately from their original place between the documents. However, if there is a risk of losing the connection between their original location and the place where they are stored separately, it is better to keep everything in its original order and place to avoid things getting lost. If properly packed, that should not cause problems with regard to damage to adjacent materials. Next slide, please. In general, one can say that storage in acid-free material helps against harmful influence from outside. The packaged materials are a buffer against too quick climate changes. For example, when transporting something from a cool and dry depot to a humid and warm study room. In case of fire, a proper box protects its content for a long time. Leaking water is kept out because it will drip from the box instead of the documents themselves. By the way, the kind of boxes shown on the slide might not be the most suitable kind of box for tropical climates and perhaps less controlled environments. The hole in the box might give unwanted visitors like pests free entrance to the box's content. Proper boxes also protect from mechanical damage, but only when the materials are packed in fitting boxes, meaning that there is not too much or too little space around them. If not, packing may work contra and cause damage because they are either too tight or leave room for movement and deformation of the documents inside, as in the picture on the right. Next slide, please. Has the National Archives of the Netherlands ever tested archive storage facilities, which include file boxes, archive covers, and archive robes? The short answer is yes, we have. Next slide, please. In our Archives Act, or rather the regulations that come with the Act, we have described what kind of packing is required for archival documents. Acid-free, long-lasting, no negative effect of the materials that are in contact with the documents, etc., etc. These regulations refer to our so-called ICN kwaliteitseisen, or quality demands, and they are downloadable in Dutch from the RCE website as mentioned on the slide. Next slide. Questions about digitization. How to handle archives material when in the digitizing process. And the simple answer to that question is, well, not very different from any other reason why you handle archival materials. Always with care and common sense in order to prevent damage. Next slide, please. However, there are some things that seem like day-to-day business, while because they are about archives that are meant to be kept forever, they should be done with more than normal care. This picture, for example, shows how transport should not be done. Archival materials are too vulnerable to be stored or transported like this. There's no packing except for the acid-free wrappers, and they are acid-free, but they are too flimsy to really protect the archives during transportation and even storage. Especially fragile objects, because of brittle paper or paper damaged by mold or insects, should be packed with more care to avoid damage, especially during transportation. Next slide, please. Another thing about digitization is that it is often thought to be more simple than it is in reality. As shown in this picture, for example, one often is confronted with documents that are not really straight. Papers that are folded but damaged on the folds, papers that are glued on other papers but with text on the back. It is important to think ahead and try to imagine how this kind of documents can be scanned properly and what is needed to do so. And, in my opinion, just as important, how are you going to show the public the original situation? Next slide, please. As for example, the left image showing a letter sealed on another document, probably because they belong together. Cutting loose the strip between these two documents carries the risk of losing their connection, at the very least visually. The book on the right is extremely voluminous. How would you show that when digitized? These are aspects that should be considered seriously before starting a digitizing project. Obviously, there is much more to say about digitization and how physical archives should be prepared for it, even so much more that it's better to dedicate a separate meeting to that subject. Next slide, please. Questions about climate. From the experience of the National Archives of the Netherlands, what were the main factors that caused the destruction of the archives from the VOC era to the Dutch East Indies? That will probably be storage in warm and humid conditions. Next slide, please. This is an example of a document that is now stored in the depot of the National Archives of the Netherlands, but of which we know that it has been stored in the tropics for a long time. As you can see, it is heavily damaged by ink corrosion. In our archives, in our repositories, we can see the difference in condition between those documents of the VOC that have always been stored in Western Europe and those that have come from, example, from Batavia, Suriname, or Africa. Those stored in Western Europe, in the milder climate, are often in much better condition than those that were for a long time stored in the tropics. Since we know that recipes and fabrication of paper and ink were regulated and distributed centrally by the VOC, it must have been the storage conditions that have caused the biggest difference in damage. Next slide, please. Environmental control. What is the best way to control and monitor the environment with cost-efficient funding? Next slide, please. To monitor the environment, it is not necessary to have a central monitoring system, although obviously that is the most comfortable situation. You have the most control what happens in the depots. However, if you have time to check the depots on a daily basis by hand with a portable device, that is as good an option. Make notes of temperature and relative humidity while doing that, and after a few weeks, you can see if there are any significant changes over time. As the topics that we will discuss hereafter will show, it is probably most important to check on relative humidity and to take action when this appears to be too high for a longer period. Next slide, please. There are three important risks to take into account when considering the environment to store archival materials in any climate, but perhaps even more in a tropical climate: mold, pests, and accelerated aging. To start with the first, mold growth is directly related to high humidity, helped by high temperatures and an environment with enough surfaces that are attractive to mold. Paper is very attractive because it contains a lot of water, and it is the water that is needed by mold to develop. This is why a depot and its content have to be kept as clean as possible. Dust and debris are as attractive to mold spores as the paper itself. The upper graph shows how much time is needed for mold spores to develop at a certain temperature and relative humidity. It is clear that the more humid the surface, the faster the spores develop and form mycelium, as is shown in the lower graph. The process generally starts from 70% relative humidity at 30 degrees Celsius. In other words, the more humid, the bigger the chance that mold develops. And this is why the relative humidity should be kept preferably below 60% at least. If it appears difficult to keep the RH below 60%, as is imaginable in a very humid climate like the tropics, then it helps enormously to create air movement in the repository. Next slide, please. These questions are about pest management, and they are related to the next question, and I will answer that one first on the next slide. Whether we should store damaged archives in different places, or should you store everything in the same place? Next slide, please. In archival storage, we don't make a difference between damaged and undamaged documents. Perhaps you would like to store much used archives near the reading room, or store the most valuable documents in a separate rack. But there is no rule for that. The only really valid reason to store damaged archives separately is when there is reason to think that the damaged archives are affected by something contagious, and that they still are, like mold or pests, and you don't know if these are still active. Having a quarantine room is a good idea. A room or closet separated from everything that is aimed to bring in the depot for storage. Next slide, please. And with this, we come to the topic of pest management, or integrated pest management, as we rather say. The integrated part is mainly about that there are several issues to take care of to be effective in your pest management. The first step is to avoid pests coming in or staying at your building and repository. Good maintenance of the building helps. Screens in the windows, if there are windows in your repository, relative low RH and temperature, and a clean environment in and around the depot are all aspects to take care of that help to avoid any insects or other pests coming in. Also, check incoming archives on infestations and store them separately in a quarantine room until you are sure that it is safe to bring them into the depot. Another important one, keep relative humidity and temperature as low as possible and take care of air movement in the repository, also to make the environment less attractive. Monitoring with traps will give you an idea of the kind of insects are around. Do not expect that these traps will catch all insects. Regularly checking the traps and making notes every round will give you an idea of what is normal in your repository, and they will alarm you when there are suddenly many more insects in the traps, as this may indicate something is happening that you don't want to happen. We focus mainly on prevention because solutions for infested collections are almost always harmful. Plus, they don't solve pest problems. Chemicals, pesticides like thymol and ethylene oxide are harmful for human health as well as collections. And anyway, the damage has already been done when you use them. Next slide, please. Last but not least of the threats to your paper is the effect of temperature and relative humidity on paper degradation. In general, one can state that the cooler and drier paper collections are stored, the slower its degradation takes place. In addition to that, it appears that paper with a lower pH, like pH 4, suffers more from higher temperature and relative humidity than paper with a pH of 8. The pH 4 is on the left and the pH 8 is on the right. This is shown in the so-called isotherms here. The blue cross shows the effect on life expectancy at about 18 degrees Celsius and 50% RH. As you see, good quality paper with a pH of 8 will last more than the average time expected, shown as 1.0 in the diagram. The light greenish area. For lesser quality paper with a pH of 4, these values are already too high, as is shown in the diagram on the left. Lifetime expectancy is reduced to less than half of the time expected for good quality paper. Next slide, please. These diagrams show what happens for tropical areas more realistic temperature and relative humidity values. Here, about 23 degrees Celsius and 60% humidity. For good quality paper, pH 8, the situation is comparable to that of pH 6 at pH 6 paper at 18 degrees Celsius and 50% RH. However, the prognosis for pH 4 paper is rather dramatic. However, the diagrams also show that a lot can be won if the RH is lowered, as is demonstrated by the arrow in the diagram in the middle. With the double effect of preventing mold development and pest prevention, it is definitely worth the trouble to try lower the RH. Next slide, please. That said, strictly keeping up with Dutch or Western European regulations, like 18 degrees Celsius and 50% relative humidity, is a challenge when living in a tropical climate and having limited funds available. I think it is best to focus on, firstly, as low an RH as technically and financially feasible, and secondly, preventing fluctuations. The importance of the first has already been shown in the previous slides. The latter is especially important when documents are regularly transported from a conditioned area to a non-conditioned area. In this diagram, the blue arrow shows what happens if a document stored at 20 degrees and 60% RH, like in a repository, is moved to an area at 25 degrees and 80% relative humidity. For example, from the depot to the reading room. The right axis shows that the absolute humidity around the object changes from 9 grams per kilo to 16 grams. That means that the document absorbs a lot of water. But there is also a risk of condensation, like if you take a can of lemonade from the fridge. When the document, after it has been used, is brought back to the depot, it will lose a lot of water vapor because the document will seek a new equilibrium with the much drier air around it. This absorption-desorption activity leads to expansion and shrinkage of the paper and may cause damage, especially if the paper or parchment is part of a construction with different materials that have different amounts of expansion and shrinkage. Because of this, it is a good idea to implement acclimatization phases when taking objects out of the repository or bringing them back, if the adjacent rooms have very different climates, or consider more or less comparable climates in every room where archives are stored or worked with. Next slide. Then there were some questions about buildings, like this one, how we can implement the more sustainability in constructions for archives in tropical countries. Next slide, please. Well, of course, we are conservation specialists and not building technicians. However, we can think of a few things that may be good to keep in mind when talking to those who know about buildings but not about collection keeping like you do. The building you would like to have should be safe for your collection. It should provide as optimal storage conditions as possible, while at the same time be as sustainable as possible. In tropical countries, we suppose dehumidifying is perhaps even more important than lowering temperature, and perhaps more feasible, although I must admit that I'm not sure about that, as well as moving air. You could try to use solar energy wherever you can. And I think you should not be afraid of archives conservation principles, because those are the building stones on which to develop sustainable archival buildings. I found some Australian publications about sustainable buildings or even archival buildings in the tropics. I think most important is to be aware of the fact that archivists should not try to build a green archive by themselves, but that they should collaborate with architects, designers, and engineers in order to find sustainable ways to optimal storage of our cultural and societal heritage. Next question, please. And what is the impact of climate change and disasters on archival collection and facilities in the archive's response? Well, we think climate change will definitely cause more floods and fires, as we already see happening around the world. And the only response we can give to that is when planning for a new archival building, one should take care of a location that is least at risk. In other words, not near the riverbank, rather on a higher spot, and choose a building construction that is as water and fireproof as possible. Next slide, please. And apart from that, I think we all should think about how we can live as sustainable as possible, because it is us who cause the climate change. Next slide, please. Thank you for your attention. I hope this was an informative presentation, but if you have more questions, there is now room for you to ask them.
Thank you, Ms. Gabriela, for your presentation. It is a very interesting information that we have got right now. Let's give applause to Ms. Gabriela. Last 60 minutes. Last 60 minutes presentation of Ms. Gabriela. I have noted some important information. So as long as the information of the archive is retrievable, we can save the archives, but sometimes it is better to copy the archives instead. We have to save the archives when it has personal information and also historical information. And in archive conservation, there are some important things to do. Those are preventive conservation, passive conservation, active conservation, and also restoration. We can also do damage assessment to decide whether we treat or not the archives by thinking what kind of information we need and also what objects we need. And then by doing it, we can do a survey, and then we can measure the pH of the archives on the subjects or archives we really need. And we can do also digitalization during a transfer, so that it will be more effective. And by doing digitalization, it is very difficult because there are some forms of the archives. So we have to make sure that the archives are visible to be able to show to the public. And by doing pest management, we have to give our attention to health, to human health, and also to the environment. So that is the summary of the presentation of Ms. Gabriela. Let's give applause once again to our speakers today. Now we are going to discuss a session, but before we start it, let me ask a question to our speakers as a moderator. So Ms. Gabriela, I have a question for you. So maybe you have partly explained about this one, but I just want to summarize to our participants today. So, Ms. Gabriela, do you have also the same challenges in the National Archive of the Netherlands, like we have now because of the rising temperatures and also high humidity? Or maybe do you have also problem with pests, and do you have to check the archives frequently? And then you have to also to check your archives frequently to make sure that they are safe. Yeah. Maybe you can answer to my question.
Yes, basically we have the same problems, and we also do integrated pest management because it is the most effective way to check on your archives. It takes time, but it takes even more time and effort to solve any mold explosion or when there are a lot of insects. So you can better prevent it than solve it. But yes, okay. We have the same. We have the same problems, only in our case, relative humidity, for example, is often high, but not as high as in the tropics. And the temperatures are much lower here, generally.
Oh, we have the same question, the same problems then, like in Indonesia and also in the Netherlands, right?
Basically, yes. Yeah.
Yes, okay. So we are going to discussion session now, and I believe that there are many questions already from all participants. So the committee, could you share the questions from all participants?
And may I interrupt?
Yeah.
Is it possible to have Femke with me? Because this is our presentation and it's just that I presented it because her voice is due to illness not stable.
Yeah, it is possible also for Ms. Femke if she wants to maybe just add up your explanation or she wants to answer your the questions. This is possible. So the question is for, we have the first question. It is from Rizka Natalia Sadrina Chaniago from National Archives of the Republic Indonesia. So the question is, in your presentation, digitalization of archives is a part of preservation. How about the authenticity of the digital file? Is it considered authentic or not? And what about the digital version of the archives? If the original is perished already, can we consider that the digital one is authentic and how to preserve it? Ms. Gabriela or Ms. Femke, maybe you can answer the question.
This is an interesting question, thank you. And I can only partly answer it. You can try to digitize documents in a very superior way as in order to substitute the original. There's an echo. And
feedback dari mana?
Without technical problems.
I think only when the original document is really in a very bad condition, then you could say that the digital copy has become the original. But in almost every other case, I think the physical original will always be the original and the digital copy will just be a copy. How to preserve the digital copy, I don't know. I don't have the expertise on that.
Could be authentic. I mean, like although we have already the original, but the original would be the original one. Although we already have the digital version of the archives, right?
Sorry, I don't understand.
Sorry, yeah. So the digital version of the archives could be authentic, right? But as long as we still have the original one, the original would be the
authentic. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So yeah, now we are going to the next question. So the committee, is there any another question to share with us now? So we have a question from Putu Galang from National Archives of Republik Indonesia. The question is, how does NAN, National Archive of the Netherlands, manage celluloid video archives that were affected by vinegar syndrome? Are they separated from the rest of the compound or destroyed? So, Ms. Gabriela or Ms. Femke, could you give your answers to the question?
I think that's an interesting question, which goes back to the last question in a way, because sometimes you can't rescue those videos, and then you make a copy, and then the copy becomes the original. So this is a perfect example, I think, where the decay is going so fast, and you can't do anything against it, that you have to make a new original by making a copy. In the National Archives, to my knowledge, all the celluloid videos are stored separately. Correct me if I'm wrong, Gabriele.
Yeah, I think so. They have to be stored very cold.
Okay. So the copy of the videos could be authentic, as I can understand, right? Although we still have the original one.
Well, it's something that we also discussed about these kind of questions, and one is something when it's something original, and in which case you have to make new original, and often we store them very cold indeed. Also, we store things outside the National Archives at -20.
Yes.
But then you can ask yourself, why are we keeping this original when nobody can see it anymore? Isn't it a better idea to use the copy? And sometimes we do replace like videos or microfilms with a more sustainable copy, a copy that will not degrade as fast as as the original does.
Yes.
But if we store them, it's cold and separate from.
Is more than for the conservation specialist. We can only advise about the durability.
Give us a second. So thank you, Ms. Gabriela and Ms. Femke, for your interesting answer. Now we are going to the next question. The committee, could you share the next question to us?
Well, the short answer to that is no, we don't.
Do you see the question already, Ms.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The next question is from Habib Marzuki, and he's from National Archive of the Republic Indonesia. The question is, does the National Archive of the Netherlands also fumigate in the storage room? How often and what type of fumigation is used? What kind of fumigant is used? Sorry. So, Ms. Gabriela and Ms. Femke, could you give the answers to the question?
Well, we don't.
No, we make sure that the depots are clean and that the climatization is correct, and then you avoid a lot of pests, because I think this regards to pests. And if there really is a problem with mold, for instance, it will be treated outside of the National Archives by a company, and in this case they use gamma radiation. So we don't use any insecticides or anything like that.
Okay.
Is that an answer to the question?
Yes, but could we say that it is more safe if we don't use any fumigant while doing it? Can we be sure about that all pests in the storage room is perished or vanished?
I think monitoring, so checking if there is anything going on by people, and keeping your depot clean and make the right climate, then a lot of problems won't occur in the first place. And if they occur, then you should maybe take action and, as Gabrielle told in her presentation, put it, for example, in a quarantine room, so separate from the rest, and clean it. But most of the time, using insecticides or fumigate it won't do the trick. And if you use other methods like taking away the oxygen or using gas to kill molds or insects, that's very it costs a lot of money, I think. So prevention is better than treating in this case. And I think we will never do it in the storage room per se, because you will also always, if you have a problem, you always take it outside the storage before you do something.
Now good insight about pest management, and then it is very correct that you say that prevention is better than giving solution, right? Thank you, Ms. Femke, for your answer to the committee. Is there another question? You shall it to us. So we have now a new question right now. It is from Fahad Rizal. He's from 11 March University, Solo. So the question is, the degradation of archives is capable from the ink corrosion alone. How do we tackle this problem, as we haven't even used the correct ink based on the standards given? How about preserving the archives if the materials from the archives itself haven't complied the standards then? Is there any differences? Is there any difference from the standardized materials used? So, Ms. Femke or Ms. Gabriela, could you give explanation to this question?
Well, I think the ink corrosion is something of the older archives, and you have a lot of document. There are a lot of documents written with ink, Arangol ink, and when you store those in humid conditions, you might expect the ink corrosion to start and to develop. I think if materials are used that are not of a very good quality, then the best you can do is take care of a good climate, because the climate, the circumstances where you store the archives, they have the most direct impact on degradation. So the combination of perhaps bad materials in the archives and a storage climate that is warm and humid, that will definitely cause accelerated degradation. So if you, you cannot change the materials the archives are made of, but you can do something about the climate. So that will be the most effective way to slow down a bit the degradation.
Okay. Now we know how to slow down the degradation of the archives. Thank you for your answer, Ms. Gabriela. Is there another question? Okay. So we have new question right now. It is from Yana Suliana from the National Archives of the Republic of Indonesia. So the question is, the most difficult thing in maintaining storage condition is achieving and maintaining ideal humidity. Do you really need a dehumidifier for archive storage, or is there an easier and more economical way? Maybe Ms. Gabriela has already explained about it. Maybe you can repeat and give more explanation. So Ms. Gabriela or Ms.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid you will need a dehumidifier. But there are several kinds of dehumidifiers, and I think it will be worthwhile to look for the smartest one. I'm not an expert in dehumidification systems, but I know that there are the simple ones that get water out of the air, and then you have the liquid water in a box underneath the machine, which means that you have to empty the machine every day, perhaps a few times. That's very labor intensive, and the risk of overflowing of the box. But perhaps there are perhaps other methods of dehumidification, and it's worthwhile to search for something that is good for your institution.
Thank you, Ms. Gabriela, for your answer. It looks like there are many participants right now. They are very interested in the theme we are giving right now. And then I've just get the information from the committee that there are more questions to come. So the committee maybe could you share another question from the participants? Would be a long day, right, Ms. Gabriela and Ms. Femke? So the next question is from Nurwandi. He is from Indonesian Open University. So the question is, what procedures are to be taken to save the ruined archives because of the fire, burn, surge, burn to ashes, etc.? It is a difficult question, I believe. So, Ms. Gabriela and Ms. Femke, could you give your explanation about this?
I think, I'm not sure if she asks if it's about archival material that's been damaged by fire, or that you prevent that it being damaged by fire. If you want to prevent it, of course, it starts with the building, if that's more or less fireproof, and there's nothing in the surroundings of the building that might catch fire easy, then you're already preventing it. If you make sure that you put all your archives in boxes, the boxes will work as a buffer, because the fire will go to the boxes, but often not through the material of the box. So the paper inside will stay more or less safe. And if you have burned material, then you have to be very careful, because if it's really burned, it's very brittle. So you have to be very careful in how to restore it. And it can also be toxic because of the remains of the fire that's still in the paper. And I think the main thing is that you make sure that you don't do anything too quickly with the material, because it can be so brittle that everything that you do will just fall apart under your fingers. So I think the steps are just looking at if you, in case of a fire, what can be rescued, what can't be rescued, and where should I like what should be a priority. And another thing with fire damaged material, of course, is directly after the fire. It's often very wet because of the extinguishers. If you have an opportunity, it's good to freeze dry it, because the water damage can even be more damaging itself than the fire was. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question correctly, but if not, I'm glad to give some more information, and maybe Gabriella also has something to say about this.
No, I don't.
Thank you for your answer, Ms. Femke. So we still have another question for both of you. Could you share another question? Also a question from YouTube now, from our YouTube channel. So the question is from Veronica Octa. The question is, if the document or archive can be restored and it hasn't been digitized, do we still have to restore it as best as we can? Or say we just give up and throw it to the bin, or what should we really do? Maybe Ms. Gabriela has already explained about this one. Ms. Gabriela or Ms. Femke, could you give an explanation about this one?
Well, it is what our presentation started with, that you have to consider the value of the document. What is the informative value? Does it still contain some information? What kind of value does it have? I can imagine documents that are that have a very that are very important. For example, because of religious reasons, that although they are not readable and almost fall apart, that you still want to keep them. So it's a decision that can only be made based on the content and the values, whether you can throw it to the bin, not just because of the material state of it.
No, and I think it also was mentioned in the presentation, it's important to add that once you have thrown something in the bin, it's gone. But it is possible that there's another way of treating in the future, or a way of digitizing it that we can't do now, but in the future will be possible. So maybe you should not throw it in the bin, but put it in a box and put it away and say it's not accessible at the moment, but maybe in 10 years time or in 20 years time, it will be, because especially with digitization, the techniques are going so fast that at the moment you can read scrolls that have been burned and rolled up, they can be digitized without opening them. So techniques go very fast. Especially with the digitization, I think that a lot of archives of documents can be made visible, unless there's absolutely nothing left of them, of course, in the future if it can't be done at the moment.
Thank you, Ms. Femke and Ms. Javier, for your kind answers. It is very excellent. I agree about that. And I believe that we still have another question right now. So the committee, maybe could you share the question from the participants? Question, please. Oh, we have now a question from Mansur from National Archives of the Republic of Indonesia. The question is there any difference in activity or responsibility between a conservator and an archivist in handling preserving archives? And is there any formal education regarding this preservation or conservator? This question is very interesting. I believe maybe Ms. Gabriela or Ms. Femke, could you give an explanation about this one?
Well, I think the archivist mainly is about the content and the values of the archives, and the conservator is the one that takes care of the material aspects of the archives. So that is the main difference, I suppose, between an archivist and a conservator. And probably it depends on how big your institution is, whether you have a person as an archivist and another person as a conservator. Because if your institution is very small, perhaps the archivist should also be the conservator and combine both viewpoints in handling the archives.
Okay. So it is based on how big the institution. It could be the archivist or the restorator who do the restoration job, for example, or to preserve the archives, right?
Yeah, ideal, because there are really two different specialisms. An archivist knows much more about the content and the reason why the document should be kept. And the conservator knows about how to store the archives and how to treat them when they are damaged, which is a very different specialism. But I can imagine for economical reasons that those two functions are combined in one person, but then still that one person needs to know about both subjects, which is a challenge, I think.
Yes, I think you are right. Thank you, Ms. Javier, for your answer. And yes, we still have another question from Hartoyo. Hartoyo. So the question is it easier to preserve the archives on subtropical climate areas rather than the tropical ones in relation to the humidity and the likely higher temperatures? Maybe our speakers have already answered to this question. Ms. Javiera Benches and Ms. Femke Prinsen, could you give your explanation?
Well, I think if you have a very high humidity and higher temperatures in tropical ones, then it would be easier for subtropical climates. But I think the much bigger issue is what your conditions in general are. So also, what's your funding? So how much money do you have? But also, where is the build? At what place is the building? For example, are there other problems in the area that might cause, um, uh, well, that make the conservation more difficult? Which staff do you have? I was thinking of something else, but I forgot it. So it's not only. I think it's an advantage if your archive is in a place where the humidity and the temperature are lower, but then you don't have to focus as much on that as well. But still, even in subtropical climates, the humidity and higher temperatures will be a problem, I think, because even in the Netherlands, they can be a problem. And we are definitely not in a subtropical or tropical climate. So I think and of course, one other thing that plays a part is what kind of collection do you have? If you have a collection with a lot of iron gall ink from the 17th century, it might be way more difficult to preserve it, be it in a subtropical climate or in a tropical one, than if you have a much more modern archive with modern paper that and ink that can withstand those humidity and higher temperature much better than iron gall ink, for example.
You, Ms. Femke, for your excellent answer. So we have the last question for this webinar. The committee, could you share the question to us? So the last question is from Suparjo Rohman. The question is, in disruptive era, records and archives are undergoing transformation, and also archivist knowledge. Archivists need an innovative approach to grounding in the fundamental concepts about digital preservation. What is the most essential factor to do digital preservation? So, Ms. Gabrielle and Ms. Femke, could you give your insight about this one?
I'm afraid not, because I don't know anything about digital preservation, if I'm to be honest.
No, it's, I think, what we said about archivists and conservators who all have specific knowledge that also goes for digital preservation. And I'm afraid we don't have this specific knowledge. The only thing that I can think of is that you store it somewhere that it will be always retrievable. So at a safe place where you know that, preferably outside your own building, that you know that you can always retrieve it when something happens to the digital documents. But as Gabrielle said, and I also said, we are no experts because we really only focus on the physical part of archives and not on the digital part. We will be happy to ask this question to somebody in the National Archives of the Netherlands if the person who asked this question would like so. So please contact us in or email us.
Yes, we are looking forward to hear more from you later on, Ms. Femke and Ms. Gabrielle. So that is the end of our discussion session. Now we are at the closing session. To Ms. Gabrielle and Ms. Femke, once again, thank you very much for all recommendations, inputs, information, and knowledge for all of us today. Unfortunately, that the time is so short, I hope we will have other sessions to talk more about preservation of archives in tropical climates. So everyone, it was so wonderful that we have already learned about preservation of archives in tropical climates. I'm 100% sure that you know already what you have to do in order to preserve all important archives, although we are now in an unfriendly location. To Miss Vincent and Miss Gabriela and Miss Femke, I believe that everyone now wants to hear your closing statements. I would like to hear first from Miss Gabriela. So, Miss Gabriela, could you give us your closing statement regarding to the team?
My closing poo.
Yeah.
Well, I think we talked about a lot of subjects, and I think the most important thing about conservation, whether it is in the tropics or wherever, that everybody is aware of the things you do with the paper have effect on their durability. And this goes from knowing that you should not drink a cup of coffee above this VOC book to not close, to be aware of things that are not normal in the repository. So awareness of what is necessary to keep these archives in good order, I think that is the most important thing.
Yes. Thank you, Ms. Gabriela, for your closing statement. And now I would like to hear from Ms. Femke. So, Ms. Femke, we would like to hear a closing statement from you. So, Ms. Femke, the date is from you.
Thank you, Hal. Thank you very much. Yes, I think we touched upon a lot of subjects, and I can imagine that there are also still a lot of questions about the things that we said, or that some things are still not clear. And I see in the Q&A that there are 29 questions, and I think we didn't answer them all. So please do contact us if you want to have some information about something we said, or you just think I didn't quite get what they meant, but I'm really curious and I want to know what that was about, or I need more information. We are happy to help. I think we were very glad that we were invited here. And it was an honor to do this together with you. So thank you very much.
Ms. Femke for your statement, and also Ms. Gabriela, thank you also for your closing statement. So we are now coming to a very end of our webinar. I would like to thank everyone for joining this webinar. Don't forget, we still have another upcoming webinar soon. So make sure that you follow our Instagram account, Arsip Nasional LE, and subscribe our YouTube channel, Arsip Nasional LE, to know more about the next webinars. Now, I will take over my job as moderator to Miss Belly as our Master of Ceremony. Miss Belly. Ya, Miss Belly. So,
Bapak Anwar atas berkenan Bapak untuk memandu jalannya diskusi pada hari ini.
Sama-sama Ibu Belly. See you next time, everyone. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Sekali lagi kami mengucapkan terima kasih banyak kepada Bapak Anwar yang diskusi pada hari ini. sehingga diskusi pada lancar dan menarik. Hadirin, yang selesai sudah acara kita pada nama panitia yang bertugas, kami ucapkan terima kasih banyak atas perkenan Bapak dan Ibu dari Preservasi dari Arsip Nasional Republik Indonesia, dan kami mohon maaf atas segala kekurangan dan juga perkataan yang kurang berkenan. Sampai bertemu lagi. Selamat sore, Pak.